This is Space Minds from SpaceNews. In this episode of Space Mind, David Ariosto interviews Matt Kuta, president and co-founder of Voyager Technologies, about how the company is pursuing a commercialized future in low Earth orbit, Voyager's rapidly growing military and missile defense division, and how to responsibly deploy AI in space systems.
The most important conversations in space are happening now. Be a part of the discussion at Space Symposium April 13th through 16th, 2026 in Colorado Springs, Colorado, where ideas take flight and the future of space is made.
Matt Kuta, president and co-founder of Voyager Technologies. It's so good to have you on the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's been a big month for you this month. I mean, you just had a 4-year deal, $24.5 million contract with NASA. This is for mission management services with ISS. Let's just start there, because this seems like this is a very good opportunity to get increased operational understanding of the LEO environment within the ISS as a sort of precursor to that 2029 launch of Starlab. So maybe just like set the table for us a little bit in terms of what that contract means, and then bleed into where we're going.
Yeah, no, and it's interesting because Voyager, through a company we acquired a couple years ago called Nanoracks, is very active in the mission management, having done well over 1,000 missions to the ISS. So this is really a continuation of that heritage and skill set that we have. But I think more importantly than the contract is it's a continued example of the ability for a company like Voyager to commercialize LEO, commercialize the space station. Whether we're doing stuff with NASA or with private companies, this is really a part and parcel to Voyager's DNA as a commercial operator in space, particularly in LEO, being our bread and butter. So yeah, we're very excited to continue that.
Yeah, I mean, just the context of that and how it's all the sort of new activity that's going on, the questions about SpaceX IPO. I mean, there's just this flurry of activity now in LEO, everything from, in situ manufacturing and on-orbit servicing to just the growth of commercial space stations themselves. And it just seems like there's this public awareness that's changing now, in just the sense that like this is no longer sci-fi, this is no longer the pure purview of purely federal governments, but a true sort of next layer of almost an industrial factory floor, as it were. And I'm wondering, when you're starting to look at sort of the key drivers of how to make this viable, how to make this profitable, I would imagine microgravity research has got to be right at the top of that list there in terms of virtue of everything that you can do in tandem with some of the laser optic stuff. And so I was wondering if you can kind of like pick apart a little bit more of that model.
Yeah, so we have been generating revenue and profit in LEO for over a decade, when you account for the heritage of Nanoracks and some of the other assets we've acquired. So I think what's less known is how do you do that beyond just building a piece of hardware, charging a single margin for a singular thing and delivering it to the customer, but actually having more of a recurring or very frequently reoccurring business model where you're able to monetize some sort of an asset. And, of course, the federal government spends hundreds of millions of dollars on research and development in LEO, but they're not the only ones. And, you mentioned pharmaceutical companies and there's life sciences or semiconductors. And these are things that we're already doing in LEO. But what's really interesting is the International Space Station is owned by multiple governments, as you know. And so it's difficult for the private sector users to, like, who do I call? Like, what's the safety requirements? How long is it going to take? And then there's intellectual property conversations as well. It's like, well, it's a government laboratory. Who owns the IP that's created? So we think about a fast forward in the future, a commercial platform such as a space station, really any commercial infrastructure, but in this case, a commercial space station. You're like, well, who owns the IP? Well, probably the customer who pays to develop it. And they're really just accessing this microgravity laboratory and using it as a service. Now, there's other ways to monetize IP from a laboratory perspective, but I'm of the mindset that a commercial space station does not address existing market demand. It creates demand because it unlocks new intellectual property value creation. Pharmaceutical companies aren't terribly interested in to spend significant sums of money and then have the laboratory own the intellectual property. They want to own that. But if they can do it in a setting where they can retain ownership of the IP, it becomes, very compelling.
And the iterative process strikes me as sort of the true paradigm shifter here in terms of all of this. Not only launch reusability, but reentry vehicles and the ability to kind of quickly fix, iterate, bring products to market. But I think that's the real question that I have when it comes to sort of the market space, because IP makes sense, right, in terms of developing new technologies that you just simply can't forge on Earth. But it's the delivery mechanism back to Earth. If you're manufacturing some of these semiconductor wafers, or you're doing things with these crystal lattices that you just simply can't do on Earth, do you envision the way Varda does sort of this, this fast reentry capacity in which it truly does become more like a factory line?
Yeah, I mean, to your point, down mass is a bottleneck, right? So being able to down mass whatever product you're doing, and Varda's not the only one. I'm sure you've probably heard of Outpost, another great company that is working on down mass. There's also, as you know, national security use cases, and particularly national security customers of, call it down mass as geopolitical events arise.
Yeah.
But as more and more down mass becomes, needed, and you have maybe like a governmental customer that's using it as well for national security reasons, and the overall costs start to come down, and it becomes even more monetizable.
Let's unpack that a little bit. Down mass as geopolitical concerns arise. I want you to kind of explain that a little bit more, because are we talking about sort of weapons systems delivery? We're talking about human systems delivery in terms of some of the long-term potential endeavors that we've seen on the schematics for Starship modifications. I mean, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, I mean, it can mean a lot of things. I think as it relates to Voyager, I can speak to Voyager when I think about down mass as a national security concern or solution. Is, say there's some sort of geopolitical event occurring, and you might want to have the ability to down mass something quickly to get to some troops on the ground or whatever. It's less about weapon systems, to your point, and more about strategic supplies or point of delivery much faster for certain types of things. But of course, you could extrapolate that into, there's no difference. You don't really need a human-rated space station to down mass like a weapons delivery system. You could basically just do that from some sort of weather vehicle.
So from the defense perspective, there's a lot of companies that are interested in sort of pursuing what has been sort of a reprioritized shift in defense spending and a revamp of the nation's space program. That's part and parcel of the Golden Dome. But I think Golden Dome is sort of this. It's not an ill-defined strategy, but it's just a voluminous strategy that has all these different components to it that are sometimes not necessarily inherently connected the way you might think of a singular program. But in terms of missile defense, which I think is sort of the crux of a lot of this, Voyager's sort of marketed, and it strikes me, is in propulsion tech and a lot in optical navigation and control. First of all, is that fair? And second of all, like what is the future around that in terms of your company's plans?
Yeah. So, a lot of folks know Voyager for some of the stuff we're doing on Starlab, but really that's the smallest part of our company. Our defense national security business is the largest, fastest growing part of Voyager. We're very excited about that. We just broke ground on a new weapons manufacturing facility in southern Colorado at an old Army ammunition depot called Puebloplex that we're very excited about. So you think about solid rocket motors to we do some black powder production propellants, all these types of things go on different types of rockets and missiles. So there's an interceptor program called Next Generation Interceptor, which is to defend the U.S. from Chinese, Russian, or North Korean nuclear intercontinental ballistic missiles. So we have technology past CNR phase on that program. That's very, very important to the program as part of the propulsion system. That same technology is applicable to multiple other programs in the weapons defensive system, if you will, different weapons systems, if you will, programs. So to think through Golden Dome, it's the way I think about it. It's more of a brand, and then inside that brand, there's multiple systems. Some of those systems already existed well before Golden Dome was even an idea. Like you're not going to use an NGI missile to shoot down a $10,000 conventional drone, right? Conversely, what you would use to try to shoot down a drone wouldn't work for shooting down an intercontinental ballistic nuclear tipped missile. So there's different layers of the onion, and where Voyager plays throughout all of that is in the energetics. So the kind of fuel piece, then the actual the propulsion piece on the ability to modulate solid state propulsion, which we're very excited about. And then of course there's in the Golden Dome nomenclature, there's also the space-based interceptor aspect as well, which is kind of a new part of interceptor stuff that is kind of part of that broader umbrella.
Well, it also strikes me that there's just such a multiplicity of threats here in terms of, the sort of conventional ICBMs to, advances in ramjet technology to sort of the wild advances that we've seen in China, Russia, North Korea, Iran when it comes to hypersonics. And there strikes me there has to be a degree of sensor fusion in terms of how you identify these objects, probably in space, as well as, when they're initially launched. And I'm wondering how you kind of think about that in terms of in-space compute and the systems themselves that sort of augmented these legacy systems that have been in place for so long. Because it strikes me like we're at the vanguard now of this very important new paradigm shift, as cliche a term as that is, in terms of preparedness and security, not least of which because some of these things happen over populated areas, and how you marry that technology with respect for commercial airfare and all these other things when you're targeting drones or you're targeting ICBMs or hypersonics.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned in-space compute, right? Which is a key phrase in everything you just said, because, in a previous life, I used to fly the F-15E Strike Eagle, and we would use the term sensor fusion, where you're trying to fuse all the data from naval assets, ground assets, airborne assets, leveraging kind of space connectivity through Link 16 or fighter data link. And you would see a display of the entire battle space, right? And then even the weapons would have links and all these types of things. But when you extrapolate that to something much larger, much more complex, like on a global scale, how do you defend an entire country or continent?
Also at a three-dimensional layer now in much different way.
Exactly. You get to this in-space compute piece because there's so much data being generated, and as more and more mass gets to orbit, there's going to be exponential more data created.
Right.
How do we compute on the edge so that the solution is set down to the decision maker on Earth?
Otherwise, you have this bottleneck of sorts.
Exactly. Particularly when you may only have minutes or seconds, but probably minutes or tens of minutes to respond. Right. So you need to be able to compute on the edge reliably, send the answer down to the decision maker, and then to be able to know how to effectively respond. And that's that's a very complex challenge when you think about it on a geographic scale, the size of like spanning the Pacific Ocean, for example, between China and the U.S. But that's a key piece of the architecture.
What also strikes me is not necessarily just the defense mind; it's strategy too. And because when you think about the disaster response or changing weather patterns or any number of even frankly, like supply chain issues that you might have with like ships changing routes, or a bottleneck like we saw in the Suez Canal not too many years ago. It's just that married with digital twin technology, which is this capacity to kind of replicate scenes over and over and over again, till you optimize your pathway, seems to be the takeover in terms of where maybe takeovers is too much of a harsh term, but it seems to be the new thrust that a lot of these technologies are oriented towards. And yet, sort of the skeptic in me sort of wonders in the background, like where does the human factor in all of these things, and as these things are increasingly autonomous, increasingly AI powered, because they have to operate not only at the edge but in minutes or seconds, as you mentioned.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's a tough one, right? Particularly, I think some of the examples are used, weather patterns, supply chain. Yes. However, the nuance between those versus national security is there could be a time sensitive component. If there's a hurricane, for example, like you have some time to map things out, right? If there's a supply chain and ships are getting backed up versus this missile flying at Mach 8 is going to impact
Right.
this location in 23 minutes, for example, right? Um, so I think to your point, human in a loop, it really actually starts at the legal aspect. It's not a super cool and sexy, but rules of engagement. Is the rule of engagement? Is it okay to have our robots killing their robots? Then you take it up a level. Is it okay for our robots to make the decision on their own accord to uh, take out the enemy's robots?
Right.
And then what if those robots aren't able to make their own decisions to take out not just the robots, but the humans behind the scenes that are enabling the enemy's robots? So it gets to this thing. And I go back to when I was deployed in combat, I was flying missions in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, all the same deployment. I had 3 separate rules of engagement, and one AOR of responsibility. It was very complex, very litigious. Like you felt like you were like a flying attorney.
Right.
And in another AOR, it was like, if you see anything that looks like it's a bad guy past this latitude, longitude line, take it out. And it was very simple. And you think about this, if it's onesie, twosie, you can have a more human in the loop. But as you get to mass volume, you see the stuff that happened, like what Iran did with Israel, right? Well, extrapolate that to another country or to weapons that are much more damaging than a small little drone, So that's where you have to have a fusion of not just the technology, but also the policy,
Right. Right. You gave an interview not too long ago. I think it was under a year, on the trading floor in New York. And you mentioned this. You mentioned this line, because I noted this in sort of my prep for this. But you mentioned in your very first answer to one of the questions that reporter had given you, it was a push towards securing Western value systems for the United States and our allies. And I thought that was really telling in the context of not only, I mean, yes, you have this national security background, former fighter pilot, so part of that's understandable. But I also think, like, the notion that came up initially is it's sort of a not so veiled mention to the geopolitical contest that we find ourselves in, not only in terms of traditional adversaries, not only in terms of what we see in terms of the growth of the Chinese space sector, but this question now, as we sort of push into the boundaries of orbit that used to only inhabit with the few satellites, the International Space Station, a new sense of norms and systems, and a question of which one will prevail and how that will sort of govern the roadmap for what comes next. And I wonder if that's how you see it, first of all, and second, like, maybe you can kind of dig in a little bit to the nature how the geopolitics is also kind of working in tandem with the commercial to drive this new push. In some ways, not all that dissimilar from what happened in the first space race with the Soviet Union, minus the commercial aspect.
Yeah. And where you ended there is where I think the answer lies from my perspective is, during our IPO process, I was leaving a very large 40 Act asset manager, and we were walking out and casually they said, "Hey, Matt, what do you think that this time this geopolitical race competition is different than the past. And I said, from an investment perspective, and I said, I think it's very much different. And what I said was that if you go back to the 1950s, 1960s, you had this race, this competition between the Soviet Union and the United States. And back then, everything was government developed, built, government funded, government used, government across the board, right? And you had this competition, and eventually we out innovated and outspent our adversary, the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And to me, the point we're at right now is the same exact point of the 1950s, except now it's with China. It's the United States and China.
Sure.
And the nuance here is, how is it different? So first of all, this is a multi-decade competition that will define our lifetime and the lifetime of our children. And hopefully it's a competition that never becomes a kinetic conflict. But there's no scenario where the United States and China magically become geopolitical best friends. It's just not going to happen. So what do we do about that? So we have to out innovate our competition. The difference is the speed of warfare and the speed of technology innovation now is much different than the 1950s and 60s. You see what's happening on the battlefields of Ukraine with the rapid innovation of drone warfare, for example. So historically, it was all government owned and operated and developed and designed. And now it's the opposite. You have a customer, call it the Department of War, the federal government, and not just the United States, and it's US and our allies, who need technology to evolve and design and develop at the speed of modern warfare, which is much faster than the government can typically move. So now you have this customer who is a willing partner, willing buyer, who really wants the private sector to be successful so they can procure products and services at the rate of warfare, at the rate of technology innovation. But they want to have a partner, not just someone who's like a parasite living off the game. They want to actually have a partner with skin in the game, and that's where the capital markets comes in, right? There was a lot of investment managers who not too many years ago, like, I don't want to touch anything with national security because it's, it's outside of our mandate. And now I think it's become at least normalized that, yeah, China is a problem from a national security perspective. And there is this customer, and there's international customers. And hey, like if an asset manager puts capital in to a company, the company produces at the rate of innovation, there's going to be a very excited, willing, and customer to procure those products and services. So then those investors make money, the customer's happy because they got much more up-to-date modern technology, and the company's excited because they're creating an impact and doing their mission.
Is there, just to play devil's advocate here, is there a danger then, or at least a hesitancy or something to give you pause, where you don't have that same sort of top-down structure of both procurement and federal driven mandates in terms of the direction of some of these programs that kind of take a little bit of a life on their own and then are sold back to the government in a sense? And so you maybe have greater iteration, greater speed, and greater innovation, but you don't have that same sort of singular focus of direction that might orient from a foreign policy.
Yeah, if I'm understanding your question correctly, I think the learning of how to operate in this way, it goes both ways. It's not just the company and not just the investors. It's also the customer. And you're seeing this, right? Like the federal government is trying to procure things in a much more creative, innovative way. And they're smart. They know that if they go down one path and they just cut off a program, it's like tough to convince investors that they're not going to do it a second or a third time.
Yeah.
But sometimes, they have to do what's best for the warfighter. But I think the customers also are learning and have to learn how to procure in this new paradigm.
We also, I think when you think about it in terms of like pushing out in space, there seems there seems like three domains that are the focus, the increased focus of many commercial companies, including yours. That maybe, correct me if I'm wrong here, but the first is LEO, or at least Earth's orbits, in the sense of something that's already experienced a degree of maturation. And you have this with Starlab and everything that you're already doing there. The second is Lunar, which is a push with both Artemis and, sort of a push to establish some of these more sustainable settlements and, mining capacities and the rest of it, which you're working on with MaxSpace, with some of these expandable modules. But the next one is some of these Lagrange points that, if you look at if we go back to the conversation about strategic interests and American adversaries, China has very clearly laid out a roadmap for its plans, 2040, 2050, 2060. And they include strategic locales, including Lagrange points, which are these locales where, you expend very little fuel to kind of maintain a stable orbit. And I wonder, like, how you think about this in terms of that three-tiered system, if that's indeed what you're looking at.
It is the way we're looking at. We call it the three L's: Leo, Lunar, Lagrange. And so there's two ways that we think about it. One is the customer, right? So, and customer / policy. And to your point, there's these certain reasons why those are important areas. You mentioned national security is one. So then I go back to thinking, all right, well, at the end of the day, I'm a company and a company has to be viable, right? So what's the best way to be able to service the customer's needs? And when I think about LEO, starting kind of closest to home, there is a commercial economy right now. It already exists. So that's something you'll see Voyager continue to tap into. Lunar, there's not really a lunar economy, but there will be in the near future. And then you think about Lagrange points, like what is the commercial applicability of Lagrange points? I don't know. I'm sure
I don't know.
it has some exciting ideas, but they're absolutely
all these conversations about mining and all these other things, but I wonder about how to bring these things back. I mean, unless you actually get to the point where you're doing in situ manufacturing.
Right. So when I think through from a company perspective, is there technology maturation that we can do in LEO that's applicable to Lunar and or Lagrange? So when maybe the government has a procurement for a government-owned, a government-operated Lagrange asset, I can put my hand up and say, hey, like, this is TRL-9 in LEO. So as long as you're cool to put it somewhere else, and we have to do some additional testing based off different levels of radiation or whatever, then we're in a position to serve multiple pieces. The key difference is in LEO is who's the owner.
Right.
Are you a vendor supplying? Well, we can supply right now, Voyager, to any of those locations. The difference is LEO, I'm much more interested to be the owner of the asset, because then you own the cash flow. Right. Versus like, hey, like, I'm happy to provide assets to the moon. But once I start finding a commercial market, then you'll start to see Voyager being more interested to be the owner operator of lunar assets as opposed to a technology partner and technology provider.
I guess that's also the question, that since I get it in the context of LEO and Earth's orbits in terms of a market that's commercially viable, that you can establish that structure. I don't want to say I'm less convinced, but maybe I'm less convinced of a lunar market and a Lagrange market that exists purely in the commercial space without that true federal backer. Now, maybe it's just a question of scale and the steps that we need to get to that point, and that's for lack of big thinking, perhaps on my part. But I wonder about that. I wonder, can lunar companies and Lagrange companies ultimately, achieve some degree of independence? Whereas if you have a fickle government policy, which has been a hallmark of American space policy for decades, it could weather those storms and still remain independent operators.
Yeah. I think it depends on the time horizon you're talking about, right? I mean, when I think through Lunar, let me go back. When I think through NASA, right? If you look at the history of NASA and other government agencies, part of their what they're doing is they're like seeding, like a seed round of a fund. They seeded Leo for 60, 70 years, right? The Salyut space station was 1973. The Skylab, I think, was like 75 or something, like 74 with the US. That's like 50 years ago, right? And then there was all the other stuff with the satellites. And now we've finally gotten to the point where the federal government, really led by NASA, can hand over the keys to the private sector, say, you guys got this. We spent, half a century seeding this region, lower Earth orbit. You guys can now own and operate, and then we will procure access as a service for this. And now that frees up our budget because private companies are typically more efficient. That now frees up the federal budget so that the government can go do things that the government should probably be doing, like where there is not quite a commercial market yet. So you can use those federal dollars to go do stuff on Lunar with nuclear reactors and Lagrange points. And then in another 5, 10, 20, 50 years, depending on what aspect and who you believe, now it's like, hey, we're going to hand the keys over to the private sector for Lunar. And now we're going to go on to the deeper space exploration because humans are explorers, right? We've been exploring since the history of humanity, from Magellan to the Wright brothers. It's going to continue. And of course, there's always the national security overlay now as well.
Yeah, and in terms of that broader exploration, I know Voyager's been working on airlock technology in terms of Mars vehicles. So that's sort of a long-term perspective. But Matt Kuta, president and co-founder of Voyager Technologies, thanks so much for joining us here in Space Minds.
Great. Thanks for having me, David.